But yeah. So I want to start off with a question. So why patterns? Like the idea of patterns is very common in software, right? So just want to hear from some of you guys. Like, why do we have patterns in software development? Why are they useful? What are they?
We don't reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah, yeah. Pretty much like that's the main thing. Is like so we don't reinvent the wheel. Like if we have solutions that work well to solve certain problems, then that's if we already have a good fallback problem or a good fallback solution, then we'll just keep on using known solutions that work well and trying to reinvent the wheel every single time. I know like early in my Angular development, I felt like I was reinventing the wheel every single time, especially in AngularJS, but that's another story. But even in most recent versions of Angular, because like now we have like a lot of great features, a lot of great utilities. I would say utilities more so than features. There are a lot of features, but I think features get a lot more face time than a lot of the really good utilities that exist in Angular, and that have really provided some really great patterns. So that's kind of what we're going to explore tonight. But before, as you heard, my name is Hayden. I work for Unbox Technology. This is a picture of our office. We have meetups here also, so maybe one day this group will meet there. That'd be fun, I guess. There's a lot of open space, and it's like a cool hipster-looking office, so you know that whole thing. But we have a good time at Unboxed. We do lots of hard work, and we also play hard, which is nice. Pretty proud of the software that we pump out from our relatively small developer team, but I think we do good work. We were also recently named one of the top places in Richmond to work for 2019. It's been a couple years in a row that we've had that, so actually that just came out a couple days ago. So I guess that's cool. I wish I could say on the heels of that we're hiring, but we're not. But maybe one day, if we keep in touch, maybe we'll have something open up. Because like we do, like our front end stuff is all Angular, AngularJS. Yeah, so it's very much the bread and butter of what we're doing on the front end. Also, Nick in the back, who loves to be in the spotlight. Nick is our CTO, so tell him hi and give him a hug. And tell him his beard looks nice. He'll really appreciate that. Yeah. All right, so a few notes. The inspiration for the content and examples of this talk came from a couple places. One, this is probably bad to say here, but one came from React. Has anyone here ever used or like even like touched React before? Oh wow, okay, like about half the group. It's decent. So I really liked React. I don't use it professionally, but I tinker. Tinkering is fun. And I'm not trying to make comparisons, but there's a lot of differences. I would just say differences, more not so much pros and cons, like one's better than the other, but just a lot of differences, right? And one of the big differences is that React, being such a smaller library, is really only focused on building components. You know, Angular gives you a lot more, which is really nice and really helpful. And a lot of cases, you need that a lot more, especially when you're working on like a large project with a small team, like what we're doing. But it's really nice because in React, people are I find more focused. In Angular, I hear a lot more conversations around, hey, this cool feature. And React, I've heard a lot more conversations around best practices. Best practices in both, but definitely, especially in React, and especially around conversations about how do we build components, right? Because I would argue that it's more than just the inputs and outputs, right? Have a bunch of components, inputs, outputs, that's it. You know, wire them up however you want to, or I'll probably produce to that. And so, excuse me, some of these examples have come from inspiration from React. Some inspiration that I've kind of taken personally, as well as some things that I've seen other Angular developers do as inspiration from React. So that's a one big source of inspiration. And additionally, most, if not all, the examples I'm using originated from a use case at work. So it's not just some contrived examples that I came up with. They're mostly simplified versions of the real problems. But so that's also exciting that, hey, like I was able to use these things to solve real problems. And also, as we're going through these things, you might ask, well, couldn't I just use a service to do that? And in almost every case, yeah, you probably could. But I think sometimes the next time you have a problem, before reaching for it, especially when it's regarding like local state and local logic of how your components behave and interact with each other, before reaching for a service, maybe there's some things that we can do with our components to make them a little more I guess, interoperable with each other and independent of some global thing, right? Because the thing with services is services are global, which in some cases is great. But then if you have some really particular service that's focused on one small part of the app, do you really want that to be globally accessible in your app?
But by global, you mean Angular JS, not Angular 2, right?
No, Angular 2. We'll have that. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. But it's essentially it's global. So yeah, and then additionally, if we have a lot of like outside code involved in solving how our components play with each other, then sometimes that makes it hard to see. Like if you like, I've had cases where I wrote components that depended on services to talk to components that were sitting right next to them, right? So it's a lot of going around and about just to talk to its neighbor, right? And so that works. We've all probably done that. But then that introduces a problem of indirection. We can't really see. It's not clear from just looking at the code and looking at the components themselves, like how they play together. And so when it comes to using these components or debugging the components, it just takes a little bit longer. It's extra cognitive load. And additionally, just one thing to keep in mind as we're going through these different examples of components is that one of the things that we as developers need to keep in mind is, like, as we're building components, really we're building an API. Like, all of our components have an API that at the very least we'll use, and you will thank your past self if you build components with nice APIs. And more than likely, your fellow developers on your team will also use them. And the more that they make sense and kind of do what one would expect them to do, the much easier it'll be for others to use them, as well as yourself. Who's written code and then 1 week later forgot what it did or how it works? Yeah, probably all of us. If you didn't raise your hand, you're lying. All right, so quick overview of what exactly the components, the patterns we're going to look at. So we're going to look at something called composition versus inheritance. We're going to look at compound components. We're going to look at this idea of semantic inputs or template inputs. And then the render prop pattern. Who from React World has ever heard of render props? Okay, so new thing. You have, okay, cool. And then also the idea of state reducer, which is also, so the last two are direct, pretty much just tore pages out of React's book and pasted them in an Angular book. And it worked out pretty nicely. And some of these I would say are more so principles than patterns, but we don't need to split hairs. But anyways, very first thing, composition versus inheritance. So let's look at some examples. So in Angular, our components are classes, right? And so the first time that we need to start sharing behavior between components, or share behavior between component classes in particular, sometimes the first thing we reach for as developers from the object-oriented background is, well, inheritance. I can just have some like base class, and then all the folks that need to like share that behavior can just inherit from this one base class. And that works, and we've done that, but there's some pain involved with doing that. Actually, before we look at the examples, I want to look at kind of like some code smells and just some pain points you see with that. So one problem you have is whatever your component decorator is, like none of your children, if you have some component class that's inheriting from you, they don't get any of the styles or any of the templates. So if you want some shared styles and template between like a parent class and then child like inheriting component classes, then you've either got to like put it in some like odd central place where they can all get to it, which is fine, I guess, but it's kind of weird, or you just copy and paste. Neither solution is all that great in my opinion. And then also when it comes to dependency injection, you've got to be responsible for your parent class's dependency injection, right? So like in my constructor down here, it's like, oh, well, I need these two dependencies, but then my parent needs these guys, and I sure hope I got the access modifiers right, and I sure hope I put them in my super call to super in the right order. And that's real painful. We have some production code that looks like this, but it's like big super calls, and that's not fun. It's just not scalable, so it works. I've done it. Maybe you've done it, but there's a better way. So the first example we're going to look at is we have these little flippy cards, right? So this is kind of fun. We have different kinds of cards, and one has, let me make that a little bit bigger. So I've got some that are like definitions. I've got definition on the front, and then definitions like, or a word on the front and definition on the back. So I guess that's cool. And then stock image cards with really weird stock photos, because that's always fun. And so we see that, okay, both of these guys have this similar flip animation, right? And I don't know about you, but like animation's like painful. I feel like animation makes everything 10 times more complex. So if I could just write this animation once and then reuse it, that would be fantastic. So let's take a look at how we did this. And actually so again, like I pretty much copied and pasted the animation code from App at Work. And initially how we did it was we just had a base flip card, and everyone inherited from that guy, but it just required a lot of plumbing, and it was not fun. All right, so here's my basic flip card component. Can everyone see this okay? Good? All right, cool. And so all we really have going on here is I've got a front and a back. That's pretty easy to see. And then I've got two spots here where I can put content. So this is like transclusion if you're from like AngularJS, or content projection as it's called now, where essentially I can write flip card, and then if I have a flip card front element that's a child of the flip card, it'll go right here. And then if I've got a flip card back element that's a child of the flip card, then it'll go right inside of here. And so essentially the main part is here, right? So I'm saying, okay, if someone clicks the front of the card, I'll flip it to the back. If someone clicks the back, I'll flip it to the front. And that's some animations. You can look at that later if you want. So if I just wanted to use that by itself, want to make a point here. So I'll say flip card, and then flip card front, and then flip card back. So we'll just see how this works real quick. Oh, that did not work. That's okay. All right, we'll come back to that in a minute. But anyways, yeah, what's going on there? Oof, not starting off. Oh, that's weird. Hold on. Yeah, I know that's not gonna work because these guys weren't meant to be used by themselves, but that's okay. So we'll look at see how they're, because I use this flip card to build these other guys. So we'll look at these guys, right? So what happened is I said, all right, well, let's see, we'll go to the definition card. So if we look at how we're building out these definition cards, is okay, I've got this parent element definition card, and then I've got my definition card front, and then my definition card back, and then I'm just putting content in there, okay? So normally how we might do that is we might have like some card element, and then we'll have lots of inputs that are, you know, maybe like front is some stuff, and then back is more stuff. But then that it prohibits me from being able to like be really particular on how I want the front and the back to be displayed in different cases, right? So again, we have the same thing going on down here. Got the front, and then if we look at the front and back of these guys, like the front looks the same, but the back, like I'm able to arrange the content however I want to. So that's kind of nice. So let's look at the definition card component. And essentially, yeah, so this is all the styling. And essentially it doesn't look that much different. It's just using the flip card and saying, okay, I'll have my flip card front. And then I've got another thing called definition card front. And that's going to go inside the front. So this stuff that we saw over here, the front became the content that went inside right here. It went inside the front of the flip card. All right, and then same thing for the back. All right, all this stuff right here, definition card back, went right here. The select just helps determine, okay, where I want which child elements to go. So that's pretty nice. So the really nice thing about this is, okay, I've got the flip animation working, but notice when I was writing my definition card, the definition card doesn't have to worry about the animation. It just says, well, I know I want a flip card, and I know that I've got to put a flip card front and flip card back. But then really whatever we put down here is, you know, as a developer, as I'm building this card, I can put whatever I want here. And I already know that, okay, these click elements inside here are going to bubble up and be caught by the flip card component itself. And then that way I pretty much get the animation for free without even having to worry about it. So that's pretty cool. And then you can look at it later, but these are essentially more of the same thing. If we look at the the image cards, again, these guys have an input that gives them the front and then a caption that defines the back. But if you look at the implementation of this component, it's pretty much the same. And so that way we're able to have this one component, and instead of using TypeScript to share behavior, we're using markup to share behavior. And you know, if you, what is it, the principle of least privilege, right? Where you want to use the less powerful tool or language to solve your problems when possible. And this kind of goes in line with that, right? So instead of having to write TypeScript every time, I can just share behavior using markup, which makes it, in my opinion at least, it's much simpler and a little less error prone. All right, so that's kind of the basic idea of composition over inheritance. And that's more of a principle than a pattern, I would say. And the rest of the examples we'll see kind of follow in line with that. But that's kind of a basic starting point where, okay, we can save ourselves like a lot of boilerplate by doing something like this rather than using, like, you know, inheriting from classes. When these were inherited from classes, like I had to extend the class right here. And it's really nice too, like I don't actually have to write any code, like any TypeScript, to make this card work. But previously it's like, okay, we had to extend the parent and then, you know, refer to some method on the parent and then hook that up to some click handler inside here. And we have to do that plumbing every single time we want to reuse it. So that's just a little clunky, so we don't want to do that. But anyways, so that's all for these guys. Any questions about that idea of like composition versus inheritance? Okay, it's not a new idea, but in terms of like front-end development, React kind of popularized that idea in the context of front-end development. All right, so that's the first one. Pretty straightforward. The next idea is compound components. This was something that I just kind of stumbled across in my own like development, and maybe you've done something similar. The most basic example of when you would want to use a compound component, and I would say this is more of a pattern that, okay, you can take this, it's a little more prescribing than just an idea. You can really take this and apply it in your own examples. But the most common use case for this is like when you have a list of things, okay? So the code smell you might see when you should use a compound component might look something like this. Like you've got like a list of items and you're ng4ing over some array of things. And then you're like having to track the index to see, okay, which one's selected. And then, you know, this might be like on a page with a lot more other things. And then every time you want to have a list like this, you've got to do the boilerplate of, okay, let me track the index, and then, you know, let me track which one is selected and which one is not, and, you know, set up this click handler and pretty much do that every single time that you want to have a list of things. Especially if you have maybe like a drop-down list, you know, lists that you want to reuse over and over again. So we've done this, I personally done this like a bajillion times. I don't do this anymore, but I've done it. You may have seen something like this. But can you all like relate to this one? Yeah, okay, we've probably all done it. That's okay, no shame. But there's maybe a better way to handle this problem and have a little less boilerplate. So what I would do for that is, in this case, I've got this list of tabs, I guess, and they have the kind of this fun animation, so that's cool. And yeah, so, and I want to be able to especially be able to both manage the state of this list in a nice way, as well as be able to reuse kind of these list items without having to write boilerplate every single time. So let's take a look and see what the code looks like for that. So I've got two things going on. Hold on, I want to back up. So give me 1 second. Yeah. I had some like a little more advanced experimental stuff in progress, and I don't want to show that right now for the sake of simplicity. So alrighty, back to the example code. No, okay, still looks the same. All right, you can ignore this guy for now. We just want to look at this part right here. So essentially what I've got going on is I've got a tab button group element. And then for any of the tab buttons themselves, I'll write them like this as a tab button. And in this case, I'm just ng4ing over a list of things that I've got in the app component TypeScript file. But I don't necessarily have to do that. I can maybe just say tab button, and I could just say, you know, or I can come from both places. That's also fine. Let me just give this a value. And this guy plays nicely in the list as well. So that's fun. So, yeah. And the nice thing about this is, okay, I've got this nice list that I can just put anywhere, and I don't have to be concerned about, okay, tracking which ones the currently selected, which ones not. I can just paste them in my markup, and they'll work nicely. So let's take a dive in here and see how it works. Just out of curiosity, have any of you ever used like content child or content children or view child? Okay, so that's kind of the backbone of pulling this one off. Let's see, tab, button, group, component, and tab, button, component. Cool. The button itself is pretty straightforward. It's just, hey, ng content, whatever stuff you put in there. It's got this one. So we've got a subject hooked up to a listener on the host element, so that pretty much if anyone clicks the tab button component itself, rather than watching for an event inside, I'm actually like, okay, one level up in the markup, the host element, looking for click events, and then when that happens, I'll just fire this subject. So that's cool. And then everything else is pretty much just animation and normal component stuff. So it's pretty straightforward. So now, the magic happens kind of in the tab button group itself. Because if you notice, like, really, if you look at the code here for the tab button, there's nothing in here that would make it seem like it has any concept of being selected or deselected, and really doesn't have any knowledge of its siblings. It's just, hey, I'm this one little tab, and you can animate me. You can select or deselect animation, and you can give it a value, kind of like if you had like the native HTML like option select. That's kind of where the inspiration comes from here. But that's it. So it's pretty straightforward, and it doesn't know anything about the outside world, which is what you would want. So then over here, using this content children decorator. So this is pretty cool. If you've never used it before, essentially what it does, it's essentially doing document.query selector. But instead, what's happening is it's actually giving me, instead of just returning native HTML elements, which it can do, in this case, it's returning me its child elements that are of this type, but it's returning them in a list of actual instances of the tab button component class, which is pretty cool. So that means, okay, let's see in this tabs, let's see, where do I use this dot tabs? Yeah, so I can read these guys, and I can actually, let's go down here. I can actually call methods. Yeah, so I'm calling this method that's on the tab button component class. I can actually call these methods on these children that I queried from my content. So that's pretty nice. But anyways, that's essentially what that does. And then inputs, that's fine. And then some boilerplate and housekeeping. One of the major things we're doing is right inside here. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, well, for each of these tabs that I read from my children, so I've got this list of instances of tab button components. So for each of these guys, and this is just to make sure that when the component itself is destroyed, I don't keep those subscriptions around. That's RxJS stuff. But the main thing is here is that I'm saying, okay, well, each time one of these guys is selected, then what I want to do is I'm tracking which one is selected here at this level, and I'll set the value of the selected tab to this new one that was just here selected. And then I'll animate all of them, which pretty much just goes over the whole list of tabs and says, okay, if you're not selected, animate deselection. If you're selected, animate selection. So this is probably looks a little more complex than it has to be due to the animation. But if you like clear away all that, I would encourage you to play with these examples afterwards. Then you'll see, okay, it's really pretty straightforward. And there's like a lot of things you can do with this example, especially this guy right here. So for example, like one issue with how I've got this built right now is that, like this dot tabs, if that's looking at these guys right here. So well, it's possible that the tab buttons that I've got going on inside here could change. This guy isn't built to handle that, but a really cool thing about this query list is that it will give you this dot tabs dot changes. It'll actually give you this observable of changes, and so you can watch each time the list changes, kind of reset, like watching the different elements and react to them that way. So you can build it out. Well, so right now it can't handle changes, but you can build it out to handle changes. I actually had to do that last week for something. So that was fun. But yeah, and so again, the value of this is, okay, one, since I'm using ng content right here, okay, I've got much more control over what order in which the things here display. I've done this before, like I might have had like a tab button list component, and then you give it like some items, right? And then this guy knows how to display all of the tab buttons. And that works, but then you lose kind of some of the control over how you display them. And also, notice, all right, so I've got to give these guys a value, okay? Well, what if the elements that I'm displaying here, so what if like the items in my list right here, what if they don't have a value property, right? Like maybe this was, I don't know, like ID or something like that, right? Well, in this case, I could just simply say, well, ID. But if you're passing a whole list into a component that's then going to display all your things, then you've got to have understanding of the internals of this guy. Like I've got to know, okay, well, anything that goes inside here has to have a value property. And that just introduces more, it makes a much more like brittle, less reusable component API. So yeah, a lot of things going on here, but I think kind of the moral of the story is, you know, one, it's nice just to be able to put things where I want them, and then two, I don't want to have to worry, like redo like painful state management code for like local things every single time. So that's really nice. One kind of like bonus, so like the overly complex thing here is I like to use what's called the, let's see, let me import it real quick for fun. So I like to use this one thing here, control value accessor, and these guys, and these guys. So these are all a part of the reactive forms module in Angular, which is really nice. And essentially what control value accessor does is it allows you to build custom form controls that can hook into a form control or form group. So that's what I'm doing here, but it's kind of like an overly complex, an over-engineered example for this. But usually when I do this kind of like group and like child, so when I do like the compound component pattern, especially when I'm like curious about, okay, maybe it's a drop down or like a list and I want to know which one. Now I'm curious about, okay, as the selection changes, which one is currently selected. I'll usually build it out. So, okay, if I implement that control value accessor interface that I just imported, if I implement that over here, then I can hook a form control in here and use that. So, like I would hook in like a form control from the reactive forms module, and that is really useful. You can look at this. I won't go over this today, but this is kind of this element is in the example code here, and we might look at it at the end. But essentially, this is kind of a over-engineered way of building out the control value accessor. But anyways, that's kind of a side note.
So I've used control value accessor before.
Yeah.
But I didn't put it into a component like that because you're actually creating a template that is the control value accessor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So so I wish. Geez, hold on. Let me see if I can check out this older code that's a little simpler. Yeah, this is kind of tangential, but I do think it's important. So let's see. I think if I go here, yeah, let me go here real quick. Component. Nope.
So did you basically create a class that is a control value accessor?
Essentially, yeah. So all right, I'll go way back. All right, let me check out this one. Oh, you know what? I've got changes. That's why it's not letting me check out. Then there we go. All right, that should be good. Yeah. All right. So this is much more easy to digest. So if I go over to the tab button group, you'll see that, okay, I implemented this interface here, and I've got to do some boilerplate up here to make it work, but then I can plug in. All right, so if I go to the app component over here, this guy, right? So this is a form control from the Angular reactive forms library. So I'm plugging this in over here, and then as I'm changing my selection of tab buttons right here, then this guy's getting notified. And then, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, because it's got this value changes observable, and then I can, do whatever I want with that. So that's really nice. So yeah, if you haven't heard of it before, again, this is like tangential to the topic of like today's talk, but I do think it's important. I would take a look at this if you've never seen it before. There's, depending on like how much you use it, like it requires some boilerplate, which is a little bit annoying. So I was playing with a solution to like kind of reduce some of that boilerplate. So that's in here, but we won't cover that today, but you can look at it on your own time. All right, let me go back to where I was. All right. I always like hesitate when I like check out and then it like rebuilds. I never trust that it rebuilds properly.
You
But
never know what happens.
yeah, so we'll see what happens. But any other questions about the compound components pattern? No? Okay, cool. So the next one kind of follows nicely from the last example, and that's the idea of like semantic inputs or template inputs. So the case where there's actually a couple code smells that kind of signal, hey, maybe you should be doing something differently. But the major culprit is binding to inner HTML. This is sometimes necessary, but if you can avoid it, it's best, because it's a little bit problematic. So one reason why this is problematic is, okay, so I'm binding this HTML string to the inner HTML of this div right here, okay? So if I'm using like default Angular style encapsulation, which is a good idea, style encapsulation is a good thing, then those encapsulated styles won't impact what's inside here. And I'm guessing that's probably not what you were expecting, right? So I'm trying to stick this paragraph inside here, and I'm also trying to make it orange. Well, this style wouldn't take effect. So that's a problem. The second problem is that, well, I guess it's a good thing, is that anything that goes inside here is sanitized for security reasons, and that's good, but that might sometimes also sanitize non-dangerous things that you wanted to go inside there. So again, it's a good thing it's doing that. Like, this always works as expected, but as it should, as it was built for Angular, but maybe not always as we would want it to, right? And then the third problem with this is binding to inner HTML so if you go like a little bit lower and just talk about like vanilla JavaScript, vanilla HTML, we could either do pretty much, I can either update the inner HTML or I can update the inner text, the text content property. Okay, so like if you do, can I edit this? No, I can't edit this. But like whenever you do like the curly brace interpolation, all it's doing is it's updating the text content property of the native DOM element. Okay, and text property updates are always much quicker than inner HTML updates. Okay, so updating this is fine, but it's going to be a performance hit if you're doing it a lot. So again, you want to watch out for it. In some cases, it's unavoidable, right? Like you might have like some like really like crazy markup that you need to like store in a database and like call it. Like there's cases where I've had to do that. And in some cases, like there's no workaround. But sometimes we just get lazy and use this when there's perhaps better solutions. So we actually got kind of like two ideas going on here. So the idea of like semantic inputs is actually what we've already seen. That, okay, well, instead of, like for the cards, for example, instead of having like just a bunch of properties, like front and then back, and then like all kinds of like loading up properties on our components, it's better if we can just allow users of our components to put the content that they want. And I call that like semantic inputs because it's much more clear like what it's doing in the component, and then also it just gives the user much more flexibility. Like kind of a code smell as well when you might want to use like semantic inputs is like when you see like a bunch of properties or a bunch of like inputs on your components just to make them work, then there might be some ways that you could refactor that. So this is always dangerous when you see lots of properties. Like typically how I think of it is I like to think, okay, like I want my component inputs to configure maybe like how the component behaves, and then like I'll use ng content for what it displays. So that's kind of, that's not like a strict line, but that's kind of the guideline that I follow there. So the idea of template inputs is a little bit different. So in this case, I've got this slider. All right, and I want to put, this is a great joke. This is Nick's favorite joke. It's a great joke. You can share this with all your friends. And I want to be able to have like different content on each of my slides. And then if you notice, the styling could be better, but oh well. If you notice, okay, so this slide has a caption down here. This slide doesn't have any caption, but it should. The caption should be best joke in the world. And then this slide also has a caption. This is, yeah, that's just funny. Anyways, so this comes from like a very real problem I had to solve at work. So my thought was like, how do I give some of these guys a caption and others not? Like I know it's like there's probably like a million like really like sloppy ways we could do it, but I wanted to do it in a nice way. So let me take away the captions for a second. Right? So what I've got going on here is I've got a carousel that's a parent, and then I've got a slide that I'm sticking in each one. And then it's nice because each slide is just pretty much NG contenting whatever I want to put in there. So that's nice and flexible. But then the thought was, okay, how do I tell, like who should I tell about the caption and where? Like, should that be like, should I give an array of captions to the parent? But then like, what if like one slide doesn't have a caption? Maybe I'll just give it an empty string, but that's kind of weird. And then like I've got to make sure the order of captions stays in the same order as the slides. So I was like, I don't know about that. And then I was like, well, I can, maybe have a caption property. Here's a caption. But actually in the particular case that I was doing here, like back in the real work example where I was trying to do this, like the caption, actually this had to be markup. So, well, I don't want to go back and use inner HTML because, then I was having issues with style, so that didn't work. So I was like, I don't know, like, how else to do this. So I came up, I knew, like, sometimes it's good to think about the component API that you want and then think about how to pull it off. So I was like, well, you know what? It'd be really cool if I could just have, like, a carousel slide caption element as a child of whichever carousel needs the caption. That would be really convenient. So how I did it, I haven't been able to find a ton of use cases for this. So this might not be as practical, but in my case, it was necessary. So I'll go to carousel slide, and then carousel component, and see how this is working out. All right. So this is each of my slides, and most of this looks normal. NG content, sure, that's fine. But then I'm doing this view child thing. I'm trying to find a caption. So this caption string refers to this template variable, I think it's called. And pretty much I'm doing a query for this special NG template. I think NG template is probably the most like underused utility or feature in Angular, probably the most underrated. So pretty much what I'm doing here, so like by default, anything in NG template isn't going to be rendered, okay? So what I did was I was like, all right, so if someone gives me a slide caption, I want it to go inside here because I want to be able to control when and where it renders. And then I'm getting a programmatic reference to that child. So at this point, I'm just kind of sticking in this stuff here and it's not doing anything. All right, so all the carousel slide knows is that, hey, I might have a caption, right? Depending on whether or not someone wants to put some content inside here. And then the carousel knows, well, I don't really care about how the captions go in. I don't care which ones have a caption, but I know that carousel slides could have captions. So if we look for carousel slide, yeah. So again, I am doing a query for any carousel slide components. And then there's one really cool, so there's a lot of cool things you can do with NG templates, but one cool thing you can do is if you have a reference to an NG template, you can use this special directive called NG template outlet and stick it inside here, and pretty much it'll show up there. So pretty much I was able to take the caption from inside of the slide component, lift it up, and stick it wherever the carousel parent wanted to put it. In this case, it wants to put it underneath the rest of the slides. So that's cool. So that's, it might take a second, like you might have to like look at this on your own because it's kind of weird. It's not a very common use case, but it was the best way that I could think of pulling it off. So pretty much the main thing there was, okay, I had a template and then I was able to pick that up and stick it wherever else I wanted to. So yeah, you might use that, maybe not, but at some point it comes in handy. Any questions about this one?
Where does the caption so you're saying that in template outlet it's getting picked up somewhere, right?
Yes.
Where does the caption template say pick me up?
Where does the caption template say pick me up?
Yeah.
So it's more like, so the carousel slide knows about its children, right? And so it's saying, okay, well, as a slide here, as a member of the whole carousel, I'm going to have, I can't have a child that's a carousel slide, okay? And so pretty much the carousel slide is reading that, right? Like, let's see. Yeah, so I can like say this dot caption, and I can do stuff with it if I want. All right, so it's now not just in the markup, but now it's in the TypeScript.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, since the carousel also knows about its children, knows that it's got children that are carousel slides, then what it can do is, let's see, dot caption. Yeah, pretty much it'll get the current slide and set its caption to this part right here.
Okay.
So that way, as I'm scrolling through, it's saying, okay, what's the current slide? Stick its caption here.
Okay.
This is what's going on. Yeah.
And that's just a property on the carousel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions about this guy? Okay. Cool. Last example I want to talk about is a little more complex. How are we on time? Is anyone bored yet? Y'all about to sleep? I saw Robert kind of nodding off back there. That's okay. Probably knows all this stuff. All right, this will be the last example. So I need to kind of set this up, actually. So the last one, we're going to combine render prop and state reducer because they kind of work hand in hand. I actually need to start off with a simpler intro example. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Go back. Okay. So if you notice here, this is my simple example. What's happening is I've got a component that knows about watching the mouse, and it's just spitting that out. So that's pretty cool. And like this is a way over-engineered example, but sometimes you need to have simpler, contrived examples to make the technical point you're trying to make. So I have this special mouse component. Okay. Again, so I said that ng template is like one of the most underappreciated features of Angular, and this is probably the primary example. So I've got this mouse. The mouse knows that, so it can read its content. So if it has a child, that's a template ref. It's going to get a reference to it, okay? So mouse knows it has a child that's an ng template. That's what this is. And so template ref is the TypeScript class for ng template, okay? More or less. So it knows, okay, if I have a child that's an ng template, let me get a reference to it, and then I'll stick it right here. Okay, we saw this from last time, so nothing new. And it's got this weird thing going on called context. Okay, so this is kind of special. And I'm just passing in an object here, which just happens to be the x and y coordinates of the mouse. All right, so that's cool. All right. Any questions about this guy? All right, we'll see how it's used. It'll make more sense then. So if I go over here, so let's see how it's used. Okay. So what's happening here is I'm using my mouse, and I'm giving it that child ng template like I talked about. Zoom it out? Oh, zoom it in? Yeah. Yeah, it's dark, which also makes it difficult. All right, is that better? Cool. So this is kind of funky, right? What I'm doing here on the template is this let variable. It's almost like a variable assignment inside of a template, which is a little bit weird. It took me a while to get used to this. At first, I was like, "That's gross. I'm not using that," but it comes in handy. So what that's doing is it's allowing. So this parent mouse component is giving information to its children. And so now, so the X and Y that came from the, let's see, those were on state, which went in as the context for the template. So this guy, without knowing what its children are, is able to pretty much pass data to it. And so, again, it's a really simple example, but effectively what I've done is I've been able to separate the logic of a component from how it displays. Okay, so that means I can reuse this mouse. Like maybe I wanted to have like, you know, a more fancy one that maybe like inside here I could say ng template, let x equal to x, let y equal to y, and then maybe I want to do something fancy inside here where like I had like an image of a mouse and like a cat following the mouse, something like that. That would be fun. And that way I don't have to rewrite that component logic each time. So it's kind of similar to, so this is really where you might say, well, you could use a service for that. And yeah, you probably could, but sometimes service is like a sledgehammer, where this is like using a scalpel rather than, like that'd be painful if you used a sledgehammer for your surgery. So don't do that. And one thing we can do, because this is a little bit weird, right? So what I usually do is I'll say let context, and then this is a little bit weird, but it works. Context. Nope, state.
So you add let in the attribute?
Yeah. So pretty much, right, like that's confusing. So I do this trick I'm about to show you to kind of like reduce that confusion. Pretty much let, and then whatever property you want to read from here. So I'm going to make one quick change. So this is kind of weird, but I think it's a good trade-off. Why is that complaining? Oh, that's why. Context. Oof, jeez. The struggles of live coding. Okay, all good. And then context dot x dot y, right? So that's a little more readable. That way, like I don't have to have a let x, let y, let z for every single property that I'm pulling from the context. And it's much more clear like where everything's coming from. And it still works. So that's fun. And so I definitely, ooh, where'd it go? Yeah, so the context is really an overused word right there. So let me go back to my slides.
Can you catch event from template into a component?
That's a great question.
Into mouse component.
I'm glad you asked that. So actually, I'll get to that in like 5 minutes.
Okay.
That's cool, yeah. But this is funny, I guess.
The English was hardest thing I had to figure out.
Yeah. So, because we called everything context, I had context and gave it as, so yeah.
Could you explain the difference between template and content? Could you like ng content template? It's
Yes.
kind of similar to the
Yeah, that's a great question. So ng content is a little simpler. So that's pretty much what allows you to, it allows a component to display child elements put inside of it, right? Because if I just have,
placeholder basically.
yeah. Because by default, like if you have like child elements of a component, they're not going to show up. So pretty much you use ng content to poke a hole in it, if you will, to let those things show up. ng content does a lot of things. We'll kind of see more of what it does. Yeah. So that's the basic idea. All right. So here's the use case. So we had to build this quiz thing. Nick, does this look familiar? Yeah. All right. So we have like different kinds of quiz questions. Like this is like, okay, pick all that are right. And then I've got to, give feedback of which one's right, which one's not. And then this is, okay, just pick one of them. I'll pick the correct one this time. And then in this case, this is true, false, which is pretty similar, but again, a little bit different from last time. That's cool. Okay, yay, I passed. So that's nice. So it seems pretty simple, right? Like we might have had to build something like this before, and like we had to build a thing that was like very much like this for one of our products at work. And it's complicated. Like it's a simple idea. We all know how to take quizzes, but it's complicated because I've got all these different kinds of components who are doing like similar things, but different, right? Like they all show kind of the same thing, but like one you can select many, one you only select one. They all, you probably didn't notice, but they all give different like feedback for your answers, which isn't necessary, I guess, but that looks so bad. Hold on, I don't like that. Only correct ones. Okay, yeah. So it's really complicated, right? And like how to share things in a nice way. So the naive solution to this is, if I can find, wow, why are my slides all the way over here? The naive solution is, okay, well, I'll just have a bunch of inputs, and then I'll like ngIf, you know, show different things based on my inputs. That's fine, I guess, but then the problem you end up with is you have one component that's doing multiple things. And we know from like, you know, software engineering best practices that like one function or one class or one whatever should be responsible for one thing, right? So this introduces complexity that's more likely to introduce bugs in the future. So this is how we did it, but I rebuilt this on my own time in a nice way. Yeah, so that's a code smell. I also want to real quickly go over the idea of a state reducer. So the idea of a state reducer is I can kind of adjust the internal behavior of a component. So again, the code smell is pretty similar. Again, I'll have like some inputs, but then instead of like ngIfing in the template here, I'll have like, okay, well, when I click the button, if I have these inputs, then do this thing. If I have these inputs, do this thing. And this is, again, actually worse than the previous case. I've got one component that's doing multiple things. And that's at some point going to break or be much harder to maintain. So these kind of two things in conjunction help alleviate some of these problems. So let's look and see how this whole thing was built. All right. Let's see here. App component. Looking back, some of the examples are a little more complex for like introducing the ideas, but I guess they're more real, so that's always helpful. Oh, sorry. Let me go to my quiz component. Cool. All right, so here's my quiz. Actually, you know what? Let's go to quiz question flow. All right, quiz question flow. So pretty much I've got an array of questions that has some data, and it's just going through and saying, okay, well, for the current question, I'm just going to ng switch on the type and then show that question. The naive way of building this is I would have just had like one question component, and then this has like question, and then pretty much the question component would just read, okay, what kind of type is it? Handle will click this way. What's the type? Show this template. And that's confusing. So let's see here. Let's drill down and see how these guys are built. So I have a base question component, which does not let anyone inherit from it. We'll look at single response and multiple response, because true and false is essentially the same, but not different enough to be interesting. Let's ignore this for the moment. All right, so this is using the kind of template context render prop, as we call it from the React world, pattern. And what it says is I'm giving context here to my kids. So let's see what's in the context here. Okay, so pretty much what I'm passing to child elements is an answer click handler. I'm telling them whether or not the question is complete and whether or not the answer is selected. You might notice this right here.
This area have you defined?
Yeah, based on how it's built, I had to do that. I think I don't have to. I could rework this, but that's neither here nor there.
There's much better.
Yeah. All right. So now what goes on is I'm going to use this question, and I'm going to give it an input of the current question, so it has some like basic information. But then what's going on is I'm having the context, and then my answer is also here. And let's see how I'm using context. Yeah. So Nasrulo asked, okay, well, how do you like work with event handling, right? So, because in this case, I'm displaying all these answers, and I want to know when an answer is clicked. So in that case, I would pass a function through this context to my children, right? So I'm using this answer clicked function that I put in the context. It's a little bit weird thinking about passing functions because it's just not what we're like initially used to when we're building Angular components. Because normally we just think inputs and outputs. But in some cases, we just need, that only gets us but so far. So sometimes you got to pass functions. People in React pass functions all the time and don't think anything of it. So I figured, well, it seems appropriate. And then I was able to go to the multi-select. Which one? This one. And again, I'm just reusing that question. And I don't have to care about like hooking up any like inheritance. I don't have to hook up any like internal plumbing. And again, it can reuse this basic like component logic from the parent question. And the nice thing is, okay, so each question type itself can control how it displays and what it displays. And we're sharing this logic from this one parent component without a lot of boilerplate. There's other ways you could solve it, but I find this to be a nice solution. It's pretty scalable.
Hey, it's very good.
Yeah, thank you. The other cool thing, so I also mentioned state reducers, okay? So one thing that's going on is, let's see, current, okay, yeah, nope, not that one. Let's see, answer click. All right, so one thing that's going on is I'm trying to track, okay, well, which ones are selected, right? Because I might have multiple selected or maybe just one. Okay, so the default behavior, if I can find it, yeah, so default behavior is, okay, just whatever the answer was selected, I'll say its ID is the one that's selected, and that's it. That's fine. But then it's like, okay, well, I don't want to have to handle both the single select and multi-select case in one component, because then I've got one component that's doing way too much. So using this idea of a state reducer, I can kind of modify the internal behavior of this question component from outside. People in React came up with this, and I think it's pretty nice. So if we see here, I'm passing this state reducer from the multi-response question. Let's go see what this is doing. So the idea of a state reducer, and you can build it however you want to, but essentially a state reducer is a function. It is called with the current state of the component, and then any changes you want to make. So if you're familiar with like Redux or NGRX, it's kind of similar to those ideas, but just on a smaller scale. So changes has a type. So that way in this function I can say, okay, well, if it's some other kind of change, it's not select answer, I don't care, I'll just return. That's fine. But if the change is of this type, then okay, I'll get the new selection from the changes, and then I'll say, okay, well, in a multi-select scenario, if I select one that's already selected, then I'm going to deselect it, okay? And if I select a new one, well, I'll just add it to the list. So essentially that's what I'm doing is just, okay, either filtering it out if it's already selected or just concatenating onto the array. So that's cool. And so that way, I'm only having to manage that multi-select behavior from one place that's outside of the original component that I don't have to maintain along with this component. Yeah, I'm just returning them in an array of selected answer IDs. Yeah.
Really cool user friendly.
Yeah. Thanks. So it's a little bit difficult to read at first. I will say that, but that's partly just the pattern being new. But then it adds readability in that you're not having to filter through multiple use cases in one place. So that's nice. So yeah, I would encourage you to kind of dig around with this a little bit more. I'm actually curious. I don't think if I use arrow functions, I don't think I'll need to use bind right here. I'll try that later.
Yeah, later. Because if you're using some properties.
Yeah, because these guys are referring to this, right? So you have this issues. But yeah. All right, so any questions about this example? I know it might have been kind of like drinking from the water hose, so, but any questions about?
That was the coolest part, actually.
Okay. Any questions about how this works here? No, okay. I would encourage you to look it over later. So that's it. So we have some more tools that we can use in our toolbox, or dongles in our dongle box, depending on whatever you carry around. So I'd encourage you, pull down these examples, play with it, see how you might be able to use them in your own code. And also, I would encourage you, please reach out to me. You can catch me on LinkedIn or Twitter. My Twitter handle's at the bottom of all the slides. And then you can find the slides here and the code here on GitHub.